Oh, hey.
Hey.
Wow.
Hey.
You're shockingly close.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Hey. Calling Chris Anderson in
London, believe it or not.
London.
And calling Rick Beyer in.
Yeah, I would be in London.
Okay.
Yeah. And this is show 160. It is the first time
Ever
that we have been together for a live broadcast. It's the first time we've met.
And you are.
What's your name again? Welcome everybody to History Happy Hour, brought to you with the help of Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours, who offer a wide variety of tours in Europe, the United States, and the Pacific. Check it out at stephenambrosetours.com. And whether you're watching live, watching on replay, or listening on the HHH podcast. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to be talking about life in a village in the Third Reich.
Yes.
So we're excited about that, and we're excited to be together, which, as I say, something we have not done before, interviewing somebody live. So I'm sure we'll have a few miscues along the way. I blame all that on
He's taking
Chris.
up all the space, too.
I know. I did physical. It's yeah. So and we want to thank everybody who supports us via Patreon. Okay, and where's our graphic for that? Thank you so much for being a Patreon supporter, and especially if you're a top shelf supporter. But whatever level of support you're offering, we do appreciate everybody who helps keep the history tabs open by supporting our show on Patreon. So let us know that you're here and what you're drinking. Chris, do we actually have anybody watching?
It actually looks like people actually are watching it because they're excited about the book, not about us, but they're excited.
Oh, I see. And they said the light is reflecting in my eyeglasses. So I don't know.
That's the halo around it.
Okay. Sure. Who's watching?
Oh, we have Susan Yu, who's joining us, and Frank Cook, Ted Moon from DC, Doreen's back, and Doug.
Doug McCord is here. And we were just saying we haven't seen Xavier recently. I don't know, Xavier, if you're here, give us a shout out so that we know that you're actually with us. But we see all sorts of very familiar faces. I think that we've probably killed enough time, right, to be able to get to the
start of the show.
What is that? I'm losing the thread here. Why don't you give me a cue and why don't we get moving? Bong.
Bong. Oh, you forgot the bell. I forgot the bell.
He always forgets the bell. But what do you say after the bell goes? You say...
What do I say? Anyway, we're very excited, all kidding aside, to have our author this week. A lot of you have joined us. And we're here to talk about a book called A Village in the Third Reich. And the author is Julia Boyd, and Miss Boyd I came to the book through a book she wrote before this called Travelers in the Third Reich, which was a great story about sort of travelogues, people that visited Germany before the start of the war, and sort of the interesting impressions of Nazi Germany. So that made me aware of her work. And then Village in the Third Reich came out. I read it and I loved it, and it got a lot of really great reviews. In fact, one of the reviewers was Keith Lowe, who, aside from being an author, is a History Happy Hour alumni.
Multiple show alum.
That's right. And he said that this book was brilliantly researched and expertly told. It is a truly fascinating exploration of how a small village community responded to the rise and fall of the Nazis in Germany. So with an endorsement like that, we had to have her on the show.
We start with a compliment, and it's got to get better from even there. Julia, welcome to History Happy Hour.
Thank you. It's a great honor to be invited. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So, Julia, I think one of the things we should probably start just at a basic level. So, tell us about the town you picked, and where is it, and what is it, and kind of what drew you to it.
Well, for a start, I didn't pick it. I met somebody when I was writing Travelers, a very nice German lady, my collaborator, Katya Patel, and she asked me if I would write this book. And I have to say, to begin with, I was not a bit keen. It seemed to me very arrogant to think that as a random Brit, I could turn up at this tightly knit Catholic community in a Bavarian village and say, hi, I'm Julia, and I'm going to write a book about your village during its most difficult period of its history. But I was sort of looking for a new project, and I like Bavaria. So I went and had a look at the village, and I met a lot of the villagers, and they seemed quite keen on the idea. And so I sort of rather warmed to it. And that's really how I started writing it. But I have to say, to begin with, I thought it would be pointless, because I thought, what's a small village like this, tucked away right at the bottom of Germany on the Austrian border? I imagined that the war had just simply passed it by. And one of the surprises that this book produced for me was the realization that even in this remote little village, there was scarcely any aspect of the Third Reich or the Second World War that didn't touch the village one way or another. I mean, apart from the fact that it wasn't bombed, really pretty much everything else that happened somehow came to Oberstorf too.
Right.
You know, this book is filled with interesting stories and people, and we'll try to get some of those to specifics. But just as a kind of a wider question, and take this in any direction you want, did people in this village, especially at the beginning of the time period we're talking about, did people in the village generally go along with Adolf Hitler? Were they resistant to Adolf Hitler? Was it something in the middle? Was it something that sort of changed over the years? What was kind of, and look, that's your whole book is the answer to that question, but what's the shorter version?
Well, for a start, the village population at the beginning of the war was only about 4,000. But I think an interesting point to make is that even in a small community like this, you got an extraordinary range of response to the Nazis. I mean, there were literally people who were dedicated Nazis right from the word go and remained so to the bitter end. And then there were those who hated the Nazis and who were socialists and loathed them. But of course, there are a lot of people in the middle, people who may have started out as enthusiasts for the regime, but who changed their mind when they saw the true nature of it and ended up hating the Nazis or not wanting to subscribe anymore. But and then there were people who really just wanted to keep their heads down and somehow survive. So you get a whole range of responses. And that, of course, as you say, is the nub of the book. I mean, I was born just after the war in 1948, and I grew up it was very black and white. I mean, you know, it was monsters and heroes. There seemed to be nothing in between. And I think one of the main objectives in writing this book was to explore those areas of grey, because all of us know that real life is not about extremes, but about that sort of mushy middle bit. And, you know, I'm putting myself in the shoes of a German in the 1920s, after the First World War and the 30s. I can imagine that one might have gone for Hitler, because the Nazis promised, I think one of the key drivers for conflict is perhaps something that's rather underestimated, which is humiliation. And Germans were so humiliated after the First World War. They hadn't expected that. They hadn't expected the Treaty of Versailles. They hadn't expected to be treated like a pariah. And so that ran very deep. And I think that motivated a lot of Germans to support Hitler, because they felt that he was the only man who would actually restore Germany's prestige, put Germany back at the top table of nations. And I think that was a strong motive. It was a strong reason why so many people did subscribe to the Nazis.
So Julia, one of the things that sucks you into the book right away is you have this wonderful description of a soldier from the village coming home from the First World War. And so maybe as a way to start, why don't we kind of describe the village during the First World War and what the state of this community was in Germany in 1918-19? Where are we starting from?
Well, Oberstorf's history was one of being a really poor peasant community. I mean, it was very tough, very cold winters, and a farmer's wealth was judged not by how much money he had, but how many cattle he could keep alive during those winters. So it was a peasant community. But by the end of the 19th century, it was changing. Tourism was there. There were a few more industries. People used to come from the north to visit. Many Jews used to holiday in Oberstorf because it was very beautiful, and the winter sports grew. So it was, by the First World War, it was quite a prosperous tourist resort, but still farming remained at the core of the village life. But you know, a lot of Oberstorf boys went off to fight in the First World War, and many were killed. Life was very, very tough in the First World War, and it was very tough after the war because Germany was in such a complete mess. I mean, there was insurrection in many of the cities. People were starving. People were mired in grief. Nothing worked. It was a really terrible time, and they'd been stripped of their empire, of which they were so proud, and they were really at a very as low an ebb as you can imagine. And Oberstorf suffered. You know, people really were on the brink of starvation, and but they worked their way through that. And by the mid-20s, Germany was actually doing not so badly until hyperinflation hit, and that again affected Oberstorf very deeply. And people were fed up with the Weimar government. I mean, when we think of Weimar, we think of, you know, wonderfully exciting film and music and theatre, Brecht and so on, Hindemith. But if you were tucked away down at the bottom of Germany in Oberstorf, you just felt exasperated that there wasn't a stronger government, that they hated the Prussians, they hated the French, they felt that Germany didn't have any strong leaders and government. So when Hitler came along, many people felt, yes, this guy is going to change things. He's going to put people back to work, and he's going to make Germany strong again. But there was always a mixture of reaction. People tended to be always very keen on Hitler himself. They weren't so keen on the people around him. And they didn't like, in Oberstorf, they didn't like the noisy stormtroopers who would march through the village singing the Horst Wessel song and making a lot of noise. People didn't like that, but they did like Hitler. And in the elections leading up to the First World War, Oberstorf voted for Hitler. They switched from the conservative Catholic political party that most had voted for, and a majority of Oberstorfers did, in fact, vote for Hitler. But that didn't mean to say that they endorsed everything about the Nazis.
So they you know, if only Hitler knew what those boys were doing, he wouldn't allow that.
That's right.
Exactly. That's exactly what they thought. When anything went wrong or some hideous thing happened, they always used to say, well, Hitler wouldn't have known about that. If he'd known about that, it would have been different. So and this was true in Oberstorf, but it was true, I think, in largely in Germany as a whole.
One of the things that always amazes me about the Nazi takeover of Germany, which the key moments are in 1933 when Hitler assumes power, is how fast they move to Nazify Germany, how quickly they move in every area of culture and education and society. Can you talk a little bit about how this plays out in the town and what people think about it?
You're absolutely right. And, you know, when they woke up after the election, March the 5th, when Hitler was very firmly in power, I think it was a shock to them. Oberstorfers, as I should say, they'd voted for Hitler, but they weren't prepared to have their own autonomy threatened in this way. And the Enabling Act and the Equalization Act were a shock to many people. And the first Nazi mayor was a total disaster because he was an outsider. They'd always elected their council. Now it was imposed, and every single little society. You know, Germany is a country of societies, and Oberstorf, even though it only had a population of around 4,000, had something like 50 or 60 societies, from zither playing to fishing to country dancing, you name it. There was a society, and the Nazi legislation insisted that all the rules be written, that everybody should Heil Hitler dozens of times at the beginning of every meeting, and as you say, Nazi tentacles went into every corner of German society. And the Oberstorfers did not like that. They really hated it. And there was a huge row that I do discuss in the book, but I won't here. Anyway, they succeeded in getting rid of this Nazi mayor. And the second mayor, who was a very keen Nazi at the time, Mayor Fink, is one of the most intriguing and interesting characters in the book, because he is an example of somebody who started out as a very avid, yes, this is Ludwig Fink, who I hope you're seeing on your screens. And he, there are pictures also of him dressed up in Nazi uniform, giving very pro-Nazi speeches in the market square. But he clearly changed his mind. The thing is, you couldn't change your mind, because if you were in a senior position like he was, and you suddenly decided you didn't like it, you ended up in Dachau. And he had a very, his wife was very devout Catholic, and one of his sons was epileptic. And, you know, even for people who were prepared to martyr themselves and protest against the regime, you know, wouldn't do so because it would have affected their families as well. So Fink's reaction to his change of heart, which you can track through the years before the war and the war years, was to mitigate as much as he could the extremes of Nazi rule. So there were only a handful of Jews living in the village, but he helped to look after them. And when villagers got on the wrong side of the Nazi rules, of which there were literally thousands, you know, if you said a joke against Hitler, you land you in prison. And he was very protective of the villagers. He protected the nuns. And at the end of the war, when he was under absolute strict instructions to shoot or hang anybody who tried to surrender, he absolutely did not. So Fink was a decent guy. And it's a strange thing to think that a Nazi in an important position as he was could actually have behaved like a decent human being. But the evidence is very strong.
Yeah, I know when I was reading the book, when you see good and Nazi in the same sentence, that's kind of an unusual occurrence.
There weren't many of them, I think.
No. One of the things that I really found intriguing was just the tensions within the party as they're trying to kind of assert themselves in the town. And there's a case that you mentioned, and I'll maybe you can talk about it a little bit more, but it's Zettler and Hoyer versus Weinlein and Scheller. Oh, the case of Zettler and Hoyer versus Weinlein and Scheller. What was that all about?
Yeah, well, that I don't know how much you want to go into that, but it's a good example of just how complicated interactions within the party were. And what in fact had happened was the earliest supporters of Hitler were very proud of it. I mean, it was like being an aristocrat to have an early partyship member. That gave you extraordinary status. And this postman, who was a horrible little man who was very typical of the sort of low-life Nazi, he had a very low membership number, which gave him, as I say, this extraordinary status. But as the Nazi party grew and became more of a national party and a national force, the new people that came in rather trod on the people like Weinlein, who had been one of the early supporters, and they hated that. And so there was this tremendous conflict within the village, which is fascinating because it, as you rightly say, it exposes the fault lines within the party. And I think a lot of that went on. But once Fink was established, things did settle down. And while people had been very resistant to Zettler, this first Nazi mayor, and hated him, once Fink was there, they began to think, well, maybe the Germans, you know, I mean, the Nazis rather, have got something going for them. They liked the fact that the country was, you know, tackling unemployment, that they were socking it to the French, particularly. I mean, the hatred of the French was intense. And so they supported the government. And with Fink there as a reasonable man who was a local, he used to be head of all the chimney sweeps in the region. So things settled down under him. And of course, that went on really, when the war broke out, people were very worried about it, but the Blitzkrieg was so successful and such an astonishing campaign that people began to think, well, yes, this time, Germany is on top. Germany will win. And then, of course, things changed when
doesn't work out. Yeah.
Invaded the Soviet Union. And so, we perhaps sometimes get the impression that Germans were absolutely united across the country in supporting Hitler and the Nazis. That is, I think, not true at all. And you get this is why I think the Village book helps to illustrate these extraordinary variations and how not only were there variations in people's initial support, but that people changed as the years went by. And it's a much more complicated and subtle picture than perhaps the one that certainly I grew up with.
So I want to go back to Mayor Fink for one moment, and you literally, Chris mentioned this before, but you literally refer to him, and then you sort of discourse about this a little bit, but you refer to him as a good Nazi. And I wonder if as you were writing the book, when you wrote that sentence, did you have to sit back and say, do I really want to say this? Am I,
Yes, I think, there are plenty. There was no intention of sort of doing a whitewash job. There were some really unpleasant Nazis in Oberstorf, there's no question. And, Nazis were indescribably awful. There is just simply no way around that. But I think what one has to remember, and this is something that came across to me very, very strongly when I was writing this book, is that the terror that, if you did anything out of line, if you protested, if Fink, for instance, had decided when he no longer perhaps had the same level of support for the Nazis that he'd started out with, if he had said, I don't like what you're doing and I'm going to resign as mayor, he would have, and anybody else would have been imprisoned. There was a terrific climate of fear in the village, because although in fact very few villagers were actually sent to prison or there's always this sense that somebody might inform on you, that somebody was watching what you were doing, might listen to what you were saying. And there were certain places in the village, the Nebelhorn cable car office, the post office particularly, and some other places where they were real hotbeds of Nazism. And if you said the wrong thing in the post office, you could actually find yourself in a lot of trouble. And I can give you an example. There was one man, it was one of the most serious cases of a villager being arrested. And he was a bit of a local character, and he was always shouting his mouth off. And he was chatting to a friend in his kitchen one day, and he was talking about the filthy beer in the local pub and how Hitler should be made to drink it himself. And he was probably talking about the black market and goodness knows what else. And there was somebody else sitting in the kitchen who he didn't know. And 2 weeks later, he was arrested because that man sitting in his friend's kitchen was a member of the Gestapo from Essen who'd been in Oberstorf on holiday. And as soon as he got back to Essen, he reported this guy, who was immediately arrested. He was sentenced to death, but Fink came forward and with others managed to get it commuted. And then he survived the war. He was sent to prison, but he survived the war. And there was another young man who liked to come to Oberstorf for his holidays, and he said something. He hated the regime, and he said something indiscreet, saying that the only thing they were all hoping for was that somebody would kill Hitler. And he was arrested. Somebody informed on him. He was arrested, taken to Berlin, and he was executed. He was guillotined, and his mother wasn't allowed to say goodbye to him, but she did receive a bill for his imprisonment and execution. So, even though not that many Oberstorfers were actually imprisoned, there was always that fear. And one of I think you've got a photograph of them, the Neuchel family. were avid socialists and hated Hitler from the start. And they used to listen, as indeed all the villagers did, to, which was illegal. And again, there were very severe penalties if you were caught. They used to listen to the wireless in the evening, and they had a particularly powerful set, so they could hear the BBC. But the village mostly listened to a Swiss station called Radio Berremunster. But they listened to a lot of foreign stations, which, as I say, was strictly against the rules. But the little blonde boy you see there, who looks so sweet, one day he and his mother, who was a bag of nerves because her husband was very outspoken and she was always terrified they would be arrested. Anyway, she and the little blonde boy were walking across the market square one day when he suddenly started jumping up and down, shouting, patata, patata, which was the jingle before the French foreign news station. And if a Nazi walking across the marketplace heard that, they would have known exactly what was going on, and the whole family could have been arrested. So it was that kind of thing that really made life very tense, and nobody really trusted anybody else. You never knew who might say what to the Nazis.
There's just so many really interesting angles in the book and things that you just hadn't thought about before. But one of the other things that I wanted to touch on, you talk about, obviously it's a very tight, close-knit Catholic Bavarian village. It's very small. Everybody knows everybody else, but there are a number of Jews in the community, and they're very well integrated, and a lot of them are very highly respected. I'm thinking of Hertha Stolzberg, for example.
Yeah.
But then of course, in 1935 they passed the Nuremberg laws. So coming down from the national government, Nuremberg laws, and to eliminate Jews from society. How are the people in this very tight, but pro-Nazi community dealing with this, and how does that impact their relationship with these people who are actually they're very close to?
Yes, I mean, there really were such a small number of Jews in Oberstorf that it never really was a major issue. I mean, I think there were plenty of anti-Semites in Oberstorf, but the Jews there were so few in number, and they tended to be Jews who were either themselves only half Jewish, or they were married to non-Jews. Nevertheless, I mean, one of the saddest stories, there was one of my sources was a woman who was at school in Oberstorf as a child, and she said that in fact there was a lot of anti-Semitism in the village, and in the school there were some Jews in the 30s, and I think they, of course, the curriculum was taken over by the Nazis, which was absolutely hideous, and there was all the education about racial hygiene and all that sort of stuff. But for most of those children, these lessons must have seemed a bit theoretical because, as I say, there were so few Jews in the village. But there were some Jewish children. And this source of mine, Sibylle von Armenstedt, she remembered, and this stayed with her until the end of her life. She remembered there was one girl whose mother, who was very pro-Nazi, she was more Nazi than the rest of them put together, so Sibylle said, but she discovered that she was half Jewish. And when her daughter found out that her mother was half Jewish, she killed herself, aged, I don't know, 13 or 14. And even in Oberstorf, although the Jewish thing, there were so few Jews, it did impact on the village. And right at the end of the war, curiously enough, the Jews that had survived in Oberstorf right through the 30s and during the war, suddenly, right at the end of the war, in 1945, the Gestapo sent out notices to these people, these Mischlinger, as they were called, half Jews or married to Aryans, summoning them to concentration camps. And one of the most best-known Jewish inhabitant in Oberstorf was a former textile mill owner who'd retired there, and everybody adored him. Even some of the Nazis said that how much they liked him. And when he was summoned to Theresienstadt, he committed suicide. as did another Jewish woman who was living with him, who was lodging with him. And so they killed themselves. But another Jewish woman who was married to a judge who was an Aryan, but she was also summoned to Theresienstadt. But and everybody thought that she had been taken off and killed. But in fact, she emerged at the end of the war, and she'd just been in hiding. So there's some good stories, better stories than most. But there were these 2 suicides. But most of Oberstorf's handful of Jews managed to survive.
Well, yeah, I mean, some incredible stories. I mean, there's another story of a Luftwaffe ace,
yes.
quote unquote, hero of the Reich, and his fiancée is Jewish.
Yes, who lived in Oberstorf. And they survived, yes. There are some extraordinary stories, but fortunately, there are so few good news stories in this book that, one's heart sort of skips a beat when you hear of somebody actually coming out the other end, having survived. And, anyway, yes, there are some happy endings.
Everybody that we are talking today to Julia Boyd, who is the author of the book A Village in the Third Reich, and along with your co-author, whose name is so small on the screen that can you read that?
Angelica Patel.
Angelica Patel. We don't want to forget Angelica here. We did mention her briefly before. And, we were talking about Jews. I'm sorry. Start then.
Her family have been in the village for 5 or 6 generations. So, I mean, I couldn't have written the book without her, because she was the villager who knew everything about it.
You devoted an afterword to that. So, and you both wrote about it actually there. So that was really kind of fun to read. The Nazis are not just going after Jews. And of course, they didn't go after just Jews. But you tell a really chilling story about a blind teenager from Oberstorf who was executed by the Nazis. And tell us about him and why. I mean, you devoted a chapter to this, and why you spent so much time on this one story.
Yes, because I think, we, of course, are all very familiar with the horrors of the Holocaust. And I think by focusing on this one boy, it sort of brings it home in a very particular way. Now, he wasn't Jewish. This boy was blind. Hitler wanted to kill about 70,000 Germans who were disabled or had problems, or just because the Nazis didn't like them. I mean, it started really in 1934 when people who the Nazis didn't approve of or had some hereditary illness or thing were sterilized, forcibly sterilized. And hundreds of thousands of Germans were sterilized. And then in 1939, in the summer of 1939, they sent out an order to try and make a register of children who were born with disabilities or weren't right or were blind or deaf or whatever. And a panel of doctors decided whether they should live or die. And if they were condemned to death, then they were taken into a hospital or a home, and they were basically given this drug, luminal, which gave them pneumonia, and they died. And then in 1939, just after the war began, they decided they wanted to extend this program to adults. But it was quite difficult to kill adults in the same way as they were killing the children. So they wanted a nice, quick way to do this. And so I think the very first gassing that took place was in Gestapo headquarters in Posen in Poland. And some mentally ill adults were gassed. And then they built these so-called euthanasia centers in various places in Germany. And Theodor Weissenberger, whose grandfather had been a very fine man who'd been the mayor in Oberstorf in the First World War, and the Geschwender family were well known. The boy was born blind, but he was intensely musical, and he used to sing in the church as a very small child. And he was doing well. He was sent to a home for blind children, and he learned how to do things. And the hope was he would come back to the village where he would live with his family. But he was taken just after his 19th birthday to the gas chambers in Grafeneck, and he was gassed. And that was because he was deemed, to quote the Nazis, to be living a life unworthy of life. Well, eventually this all leaked out, and there began to be civilian protests, and Bishop von Galen stepped out and wrote leaflets, and the RAF got hold of some leaflets and started dropping those over Germany. And so the program, the public program, the gassing centers were closed down, but the killing went on, but it went on in private institutions. And the story of Theodor Weissenberger, I mean, I spent a lot of time communicating with his niece, and so I got very close to this story. And there were times when I was writing the book, particularly when I was writing this chapter, when the whole thing really did become too much, and I sort of sometimes just had to go off and go for a long walk or listen to Bach or something to remind myself about the good things about human beings. But it's deeply harrowing, and I don't think I could ever write any more about it. I find it haunts me, and when I go to a concert and listen to music, I find, I do find tears welling up because these images come into your head. And one of the Oberstorfers who was summoned to a concentration camp at the end of the war. She was at Theresienstadt, and she witnessed the victims of these death marches arriving at Theresienstadt, and the words she uses, just stay with you. You can't really ever erase them. So it is a tough subject. There's no getting away.
Yeah.
But there were things in the village. There were nice people, and there were, at the end of the war, there was this these villagers that got together and managed to save the village from being bombarded by the French, and managed to arrest all the Nazis and stick them in the cellar in the town hall. So there are some heartwarming stories in this book, as well as the horrors.
So Julia, though, I mean, one of the questions, of course, anybody that studies this topic asks themselves. One of the things I'm always asked on my tours, I'm sure one of the things people ask when they read your book is what did the villagers know? And
when did they know it?
When did they know it? Because in the book, I've heard this before, but there's this great nursery rhyme that says basically, "Dear God, make me dumb so I won't to Dachau come." So if there's a nursery rhyme about this, it must be common knowledge.
Yeah, I went into this very carefully, and as I said in my opening remarks, Oberstorf, you might think, was isolated from the war. It absolutely was not. For a start, there were hundreds of young men from Oberstorf fighting. They would come home on leave. They must have told their families and friends of the atrocities that they had witnessed, or actually taken part in themselves. There were plenty of people moving around, traveling on trains, and running these camps, took up vast numbers of staff, of secretaries, people supporting them. I mean, people running these things. And then just 10 miles north of Oberstorf, there was this fortress-like place, which was one of the Ordensburgen, which was a Nazi stronghold called in Sonthofen, and which is where people like Himmler would come to brief the surrounding Nazis on things like the final solution. And then there were these camps. One of the things that came as a complete surprise to me, we all know about Dachau and Auschwitz and so on, but what I didn't know was that these camps spawned dozens and dozens of sub-camps. And right on Oberstorf's doorstep, just a couple of miles away, was a Dachau sub-camp, because prisoners were taken from Dachau to build a Waffen-SS training camp, and they would go into the village to buy supplies and so on. So the villagers, they would be wearing their striped uniforms. And then there were all kinds of different camps towards the end of the war, when the Allies could get as far as Augsburg and Munich to bomb BMW and Messerschmitt. They moved their manufacturers out to the villages. So there was Messerschmitt factory. They were building the first jet engines that were used in combat were made. Some of the engines were made in Oberstorf and around it. And these were all, the workforce were all either people brought from Dachau and made to work in these camps, or they were people who'd been taken from Poland, forced laborers, slave laborers. And then there were French people, there were Dutch people, there were all kinds of different camps. And there were probably, 3 or 4 of them very close to Oberstorf. So the villagers knew about these. They knew about these slave laborers and so on. I think they knew a lot of what was going on. I can't see how they could not have known. And one man from Zondhofen was, he was in these particularly vile units called the Einsatzgruppe. And when the Third Reich moved into a new territory and conquered it, in their wake would come the Einsatzgruppe. And they would set about murdering Jews, homosexuals, gypsies, anybody they didn't like. And he went on trial with other members of the Einsatzgruppe after the war at Nuremberg. And at his trial, his name was Schubert, and he claimed descent from the composer. And which is not from the composer himself, who had no children, but he had brothers. So it's perfectly possible he actually was descended from Schubert's family. And he was responsible for organizing the murder of 700 gypsies in Crimea. And at his trial, he said, he's on the public record, he said, "We didn't set out to kill people. We thought we were saving Western civilization." And one has to remember that these young people, I'm not excusing him, I think he was probably a perfectly horrible man, but one has to remember that the Nazis understood absolutely from the beginning that if their empire was going to last 1,000 years, they had absolutely to capture the youth. And the propaganda was relentless and started when they were 10, when they went into the junior branches of the Hitler Youth and the Bund Deutsches Mädel, which was the girls' version. And then they went from, at the age of 14, they went into the senior branch, and then immediately they were 18, they went into the Reich labor force, or they did military training, and then they went into the armed forces, or the women went into the Reich labor force service. So, it was absolutely relentless and continuous from the age of 10. And there were megaphones the whole time in the village, Hitler's speeches and so on. So it is possible that somebody like Heinz Schubert, this man I've just been talking about, really was so indoctrinated that he had lost any kind of human sense, what it was to be a human being. And I'm not trying to excuse it, but I just think that one has to bear in mind this propaganda was so intense, and it went from a very, very early age, unremittingly.
What are you about to?
Yeah, well, no, I want to bring in a question from our audience, and this is from Wally Morrison. This is, what did the Catholic Church do, if anything, about the growing atrocities? Bavaria, of course, is very Catholic.
Yeah, now this is, and this is very interesting subject. Of course, the Protestants divided into Nazi Protestants and those who opposed, and the Catholics, Hitler particularly disliked. He always had more support from the Protestants from the Catholics, but he admired the Pope in a way, because the Pope was an authoritarian figure who had the absolute loyalty of millions and millions of people across Europe. And Oberstorf was something like 95% Catholic, And so people, not so much the men and the younger people, but the women remained very devoted. And the priest in Oberstorf, the Catholic priest, had a very tough time. He was quite brave and he was rather outspoken. And it was only because Mayor Fink was, not a hard Nazi. And then Fink's supervisor, I mean, his the next one up in the hierarchy, he was also a rather mild Nazi. So I think if it had been different, the Catholic priest would probably have been imprisoned and probably sent off to Dachau. So there was an uneasy relationship between the church and the Catholics. And the Nazis in Oberstorf managed to abolish the nuns, but they survived because the village was so devoted to their nuns. This is where you get these grey areas, because it was possible in Oberstorf to be a party member, to support the Nazis, and at the same time be, a devout Catholic. And these sort of rather, we like to put things into clear categories and boxes. And of course, as one of the main themes of the book is, you get these overlaps, these things which are not tidy. So it was possible, and there were people in Oberstorf who were both members of the Nazi party, but still went to mass.
Yeah. Is it my turn or yours?
It's your turn.
Oh, so moving away from a bit from the village, but still very much part of the story is the story of the 99th Gebirgsjäger Regiment, because that's where a lot of the sons of this town serve, and it's an elite unit, and it has maybe you could talk a little bit about its service, but also there's some controversy because the regiment's also accused of committing some pretty nasty atrocities. So maybe talk just briefly about that unit and the reaction of the community to their boys. I mean,
yes, we had a huge stroke of luck. A book like this depends so much on your sources. I was very lucky with the Neuchel family because Franz Neuchel left a memoir unpublished, but the family let me use it, which was one of the best sources. And another extraordinary bit of luck was we managed to find 2 diaries kept by 2 soldiers in the 99th Regiment of the 1st Mountain Division. And they provided some really wonderful material. And it was an elite, as you rightly say, an elite mountain regiment. And they were in the thick of the war. They were in Russia, they were in the Soviet Union, they were in Europe. They fought they fought from Poland, and yes, they were in the Balkans, where well-documented atrocities were committed. So I didn't manage to find an Oberstorf boy who was directly involved in these, though I'm sure there must have been. But these diaries were very very moving. And the one of them was an officer. He was a lieutenant, and he's an interesting character because you read his diary and he comes across as a very sensitive human being. He was intensely religious, and he comes across as a rather fine man, but apparently he was a member of the party. And you see him being, in his diary, which I quote quite extensively, you see him being torn, seeing these horrible things. Both of them, in fact, both diaries show how the men writing them were not happy with what they saw, but they didn't seem to feel that it was wrong. They still felt they were serving the fatherland, they were doing the right thing. So again, you get this extraordinary clash of people who are clearly not real Nazis, but are caught up in this horror and somehow still believe in that they are doing the right thing by serving their country. So yes, the story of the 99th Regiment of the 1st Mountain Division is a really interesting one. And the man who I wrote about right at the beginning of the book, coming back from the First World War, he was actually in this regiment very briefly at the time of the Anschluss, when Austria was brought into the Third Reich, and he hated Hitler. And he managed to, his own little act of subversion was he persuaded all the men in his unit, when they were in Austria, to chew their cigarettes and swallow them, because he said it would give them additional strength. And of course, they all had terrible diarrhea, and they were incapacitated for days. And when it was found out that it was Wilhelm Steiner, he was sent back in disgrace to Oberstorf. But yes, the hardships that these soldiers went through are quite extraordinary. I'm very glad that we were able to use these diaries, because they give a very intense picture of what it was like to be an Oberstorf young man fighting in the war.
So we have a few questions that have been put forward, and as we're getting towards the end of our show, people also want to know kind of what was the attitude in the village as the war ended. And so Dave Borland asked, did some villagers seek a retribution against others? And I think we had another question. Doug McCord just put it this way: what was life after the war for the people in Oberstorf?
Well, I think
everything all happy and positive again, or a little bit mixed there?
Well, I mean, in terms of one thinks, well, what did the Germans think? What did those villagers think? I think it was terrible for them after the war. They weren't treated badly by the occupying forces, first the French and then the Americans, but they were very, very close to starvation, as Germans were throughout the country. And it was it was a British publisher who was Jewish, who started bringing people's attention to the fact that people were starving, literally starving in Germany. And they were so focused on trying to stay alive, rebuild their lives, just exist, that there was really no discussion about culpability or whether the atrocities, or I think there was very little discussion about it. They just wanted to get their lives back together, and they also felt like victims. A lot of the most of the resources in the village, not surprisingly, went to helping the people who came out of these camps that I was talking about earlier. So suddenly the villagers saw these people that they had been brought up to believe were, totally inferior creatures who weren't worth anything at all. Suddenly there they were, being given all the resources. And so there was a lot of sort of ill feeling, I think. And I think many of the villagers felt that they too were victims. So it wasn't until really quite a long time afterwards that people began to address the real core issues. But I think that I just think that it took a long time before the villagers, along with their fellow nationals, really began to face up to what had happened and to take responsibility for it. It was some, and then of course there was this whole business of the Nazi trials, which were a disaster. It was very difficult to find Germans who were uncontaminated by the Nazi legal system to act as judges. And the people the Americans put in didn't really have any experience. People resented it very much. And so often the people who were real Nazis got off scot-free, whereas people who hadn't done much were imprisoned. And there were, apart from Fink, who I've talked about at length, the headmaster of the school in the secondary school in Oberstorf is another character who, although he was a paid up Nazi and he wore SA uniform and so on, he clearly did his best to walk this very difficult tightrope of seeming to conform to the regime, but at the same time trying to sustain some sense of humanity in his school. And when you think that any student could inform on him if he stepped out of line, it was a very difficult thing to achieve. And he was typical of the sort of person who was tried after the war for his Nazi past, and there were 5 different categories, and in the end, everybody gave up. And then in 1952, when the real problem was Russia rather than Germany, and we all wanted Germany to be an ally, that the whole thing was really dropped. So literally, thousands and thousands of evil Nazis got off scot-free. And equally many Germans who were not really Nazis was sent off to prison camps in France and had a terrible time. So it was I think the post-war picture is messy, and people who should have been punished were not, and people who probably should not have been punished were. It's a messy, unsatisfactory picture, and it took a long time before the villagers really came out of it. Of course, the Marshall Plan made a huge difference, and I think it wasn't until fairly recently that people really began to talk about it.
Well, Julia, I want to kind of pick up on that, and this, hopefully we'll have time for one question after this one. But one question that I did want to ask you is about process. Now, you go into this very small German community, and you research some uplifting stories, but also, let's be honest, some very sad and dark stories about community and human nature. What was the reaction of the people of this community to this British woman coming in and kind of looking behind the curtain? Were they cooperative? Were they shocked?
Well,
how was the research process?
Well, as we've written about this in the book, there was a book that there was a committee. The genesis of this book goes back to I think it was the early part of this century, when a number of villagers got together and reckoned they really must write their Nazi history before all those people who'd actually lived through it were dead. And so my collaborator, Kati, wrote a book for the village about it. And the great thing from my point of view is that she interviewed a lot of people who were still alive and had very vivid memories. By the time I came on the scene, of course, they were nearly all dead. So it was these core of villagers with whom I interacted, and they were very keen that the book should be written. What the reaction of it is of the wider village, I don't honestly know. I haven't heard very much. I know that my friend Kati's circle seemed to be very pleased with it, and I think Kati is because she feels that it shows a slightly more subtle. There's a more nuanced version of events than the ones that, as I say, we are so often used to reading. And I think in general, I hope that it gives a sort of more subtle picture of what it was like to be a German at this time. And I think there is a shift away from writing about the battles and the generals and the politicians and so on, to trying to explore what it was like for so-called ordinary people, and how they adjusted, and why they supported Hitler in the first place, how that many of them changed their minds, and how they sort of picked themselves up after it was all over and got their lives back together. But I think the question that I constantly asked myself this when I was writing this book, and I think it is the question that perhaps we should all ask ourselves. What would I have done if I had been there then? How would I have reacted? And it's, hindsight, as we know, it's so easy to look back on that period and think, I would have resisted, I would have protested, I would have not let that happen. But, I look at myself, and I know I would have absolutely hated the Nazis. I'm in no doubt about that. I would have absolutely loathed them right from the word go. But I'm a coward. I would have been terrified. And if I'd had a family and children, I think I'd have done anything just to survive. I wouldn't have been brave. I wouldn't have been out there protesting. I don't think. I would have been scared stiff. And I would have just survived.
We'll leave people with that thought. What would you do? And we'll say thank you to Julia Boyd for joining us today to talk about her book, A Village in the Third Reich. definitely worth the read.
Absolutely.
And Julia, thank you so much for spending time with us today on History Happy Hour.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, Julia. And you'll be happy to know, great response to the show, and people are always saying they've ordered the book online. So.
Yeah, there you go. So you've done well. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Julia. All right.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Chris, where are you next week? Where are you a week from today?
I think I'm in Poland a week from today.
Okay, so I'll be in Brest.
Wow, we're getting around.
France, and we'll be talking together, though, to a multiple book author and also a multiple History Happy Hour appearer.
I am. One of our favorites.
Peter Hart. Yes. And we're going to be talking about his book, Footsloggers, which is the story of an infantry battalion at war, 1939 to 1945. It's a British infantry battalion, light infantry.
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting because if you've watched some of the previous shows, Peter has done. He was the oral historian for the Imperial War Museum, and he did a book that focused on an artillery unit and then one on a tank unit. We've had him on to talk about both of those, and this is sort of the end of that trilogy. And this is the one that focuses on the poor bloody infantry, as they say.
And he always does a great job of bringing a lot of quotes from his interviews and reading them with great panache and relish. And accents and humor. So even when it's not always a funny topic. So we're really looking forward to having Peter Hart on next week. Guys, please subscribe to us on YouTube. Follow us on Facebook. Shout at us on Twitter. Listen to our podcast. Back us on Patreon and browse historyhappyhour.com.
Thanks, everybody. Be safe.